person that you meet across thousands of years and in this funny clay, the voices that come out, I think, are understandable as fellow human beings. So that's an important matter, because with museums, when things are in cases and silent, and sometimes when people write books about antiquity, they don't make any effort to show that the people who use them were not only alive, that's obvious, but also were not strangers in the sense that they came from the moon or Venus. You know, you might have, or robots or something like that. They are fellow human beings, and they were frightened of illness, and they were frightened of floods and fire, and they all wanted to have lots of children, and they didn't want to die, and they didn't want to go in the army, and they were happy when the gods looked after them and everything was flourishing and their lambs were born and everything. When they weren't, they were very miserable, and they tried to find out what they'd done wrong and everything. So they're all very mortal and very reasonable. And there were people who were very traders, you know, they were
very much like us.
They were, I think they were like us. This to me is a guiding principle about looking backwards down a telescope into ancient times and trying to get some idea of the people. If you don't have any writing, like if you just have archaeological material, it's impossible, because you have houses, you have rooms, you have pots, you have jewelry, you have all those things, and almost all people have more or less the same sort of things like that, not always, but almost. So with archaeology, you can go so far, but you can't capture anything of the minds of the people. And when you have writing, if they've been dead for 5,000 years, you can sometimes, as it were, dial them up on the telephone and listen to them talking. It's a very exciting and very wonderful thing, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like listening to some of Thomas Edison's very early recordings.
Exactly that. Exactly that.
Yeah.
And that is an exciting thing even for us to hear today, isn't it? When you
yes.
and all that stuff and the voice comes out, it's incredible. Yes, but it's like that a million times more. So one of the things is, I mean, in America, there are some good, strong universities where people study this kind of thing. For example, in Harvard and Yale, and in Chicago and Philadelphia, there's about 6 or 7 universities where they have a long tradition of studying ancient languages, like Egyptian and Babylonian and Sumerian. And the reason I'm mentioning this is if anybody watches you or listens to what this is about, or they hear something about it and they get interested, that you can do this kind of thing at university. And often kids, when they go to university, they don't know what to do. They go to university to get away from their parents, for one thing, and they get away and they study something that they're either very good at already, or they think they'll get rich if they do it, all those kind of rubbishy things. But actually, the reason to go to university is to study something you find really interesting. And the point about it, which is so significant, is it's the only time in your life when you can do that, because you can't do it when you're a kid. And when you get grown up, if you have a mortgage and kids, forget it. You never have time to do anything at all. And that period of time when you go to university is not just to get drunk and lie around. You can actually really learn something. And sometimes people don't have any idea that you can do things at university like this. But if you are interested, or if anybody is interested, it's worth finding out, because it's like this. You get a key to a kind of door that opens up, and there's all these marvelous things that most people know nothing about, that they think they're hidden and they're gone forever, where you can walk among them and, as it were, talk to them. It's very wonderful.
Yeah. And is there other ways too people could find a way to help bring history alive, or become more interactive with history, and with this history too?
Well, there are lots of ways. One of them is by giving talks and to people. I mean, the British Museum, for example, we do quite a lot of things on YouTube, because YouTube is a very good way to meet people and tell them about things in museums when they don't go to a museum. They don't know what they are. It never occurs to them, and they don't know anything about it. And lots of my colleagues do this. We make a quarter of an hour or half an hour, sometimes longer, talk about an object or why we have it, what it means, what you can tell about it. And they're very popular, these things. They're called sometimes Curator's Corner. And they're very popular because when you look at the comments, it's funny. Sometimes people say, oh, I never believed that curators in museums were alive. Or I never knew it could be interesting in a museum, because people associate it with being dragged there when they were a kid, or I don't know what, maybe taken from school and had to write essays about things. But actually, that's one way. YouTube is a modern way of doing what you asked. I mean, you can reach people, and sometimes people cruise around looking for something to watch and look at something for 2 minutes and think, hey, that's interesting. And then because it's amazing what is available. You can find out how to do anything in the world with it. I mean, there's no doubt about it that the good side of the internet is astonishing. It is truly astonishing.
And it's literally how I found you.
Yes,
one of your
so. Yes.
amazing 1 hour long lectures. You
Oh,
did an
that's interesting.
incredible job on Sumerian magic.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
I'm going to leave in the description for people to check out, because
Right.
I
It's
think more
great.
people need to watch it.
But
And
the
you did a
good thing
great
about
job
it is,
explaining too the spiritual beliefs of these ancient peoples.
yeah,
My favorite too is when you show the lead tablet of Pazuzu,
oh, yes.
an
Yeah.
incredibly beautiful piece of art. I would keep in my house.
Yes, exactly. Well, yeah, there are, you can buy replicas of them sometimes. I don't think they work so well if it's a replica. But that's a very encouraging thing, because people don't read books so much as they used to. They read thrillers and light-hearted stuff on the beach, and they might read about politics and history, but on the whole, people don't read as much, I think, as they used to. And this is the modern equivalent of it. So I think it's a good way um, to reach people and make you think, hey, that I never knew about that. That's quite interesting, and that's the essence of it all, really, isn't it? Just to pique someone's interest and show them what
Yeah,
it's.
yeah, that's why I started this. Let's talk
Yeah,
to historians. Let's talk to people that
yes,
lived through history.
it's a
Yeah, let's
very
hear
good
about it.
idea. It's a very good idea. Sometimes uh, people do animations of things which are very effective. Those Asterix books, the
Yes.
French books about the caveman and all that, the Romans, I mean, and all that. Well, those books were very funny and very original at the time. And sometimes people make cartoons of them, and they're very absorbing, because animations and cartoons don't have to be goofy and stupid. They can actually be written in order to make things interesting, which are real, as opposed to interesting, which are not real. So this is another medium for doing it, that kind of activity. So
Yeah.
so tell me about what you do then with this situation. You just get hold of people and ask them questions, and then you disseminate stuff. It's a good idea, I think. It's a good idea.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's so far it's been a good idea. I've had so 5 times now. I've had on one guy in London, John F. White, and on YouTube he has a channel called Crackenford, and he does phylogenetics,
Right.
where where he programs AI to translate and find certain commonalities in myths, so he can try and figure out how cultural interaction and cultural evolution changed myths over time. And it is to hopefully one day find the world's first story, which I am not even going to try and explain further, because I'm not of that brain. I'm just the guy. I'm just the guy with the fancy hat. And then for the third time recently, I just had my friend Philip Kairichi on, and we first talked about the Wild West here in America. The second time we talked about Edwardian fashion in the Edwardian era, and now soon to be released is going to be how American history in the 1800s helped create Christmas as to what it is today.
Uh-huh. Yes.
And there's a number of other, a long list of other people I've interviewed. Over in England, I've interviewed Dr. Eleanor Janiga on the medieval era and all the quirky, weird, fun things to hear about during that time period. um, yeah, it's a very interesting time. And then I have interviewed people. It was actually the start of which, because there's a gentleman by the name of Chick McDougal. He was 89. I was working at a TV station, and I had a plot to try and trap him in the TV station one day and get all the stories about town on camera.
Right.
And I constructed this whole documentary on the town's brass band, which is America's oldest operating brass band. The Exeter, New Hampshire Brass Band's 200 years old. And he died like a week before I was able to get it started. So that made me decide, all right, people that are ages of 65 and older or lived through historical events, let's find them, let's talk to them. And then one day I ended up interviewing somebody who has a beautiful obsession with Norse history, and that opened up Pandora's box for a number of other bad decisions. Yes. Now I'm here talking about the first civilization with Dr. Irving Finkel.
Because it might not be the first civilization, we don't really know. It's the first writing we've got, but people might have lived in a very civilized way a long time before that, because for example, there is a site in Turkey called Kudepe Tepe, where they had massive stone temples and complex structures and complex art about 8,000 BC, or even older sometimes, maybe even 9,000 BC, and they've only recently been excavated. And it changes our picture, because whoever did that work, whoever lived there, was very, very organized in the sense that there must have been somebody in charge who conceived of and planned out these buildings and got people to bring the materials and to do it about 9,000 BC on a huge scale. It's like a town. And that is probably as good an example of civilization, so to speak, as you'll find. If everyone collaborates, there were certainly temples, they certainly had a strongly developed sense of religion, a central authority, people collaborating together, and over a long period of time, this was a civilization for sure. So this is 6,000 years or so before the Sumerian writing was invented. So that means that what happened in between, we don't know anything about it. So the first civilization, who knows how you define it is one thing, but however you define it, this excavation in Turkey is definitely to do with a civilization. It's astonishing. It's really astonishing. So, but on the other hand, writing is writing, and it's hard to imagine how the world would have been if we never had writing. It created history for a start, and holding on to knowledge, so people didn't have to discover things all over again every time. There would be written accounts where people could learn and communicate, and all sorts of things were recorded as soon as it was possible. Even ancient dictionaries on these tablets come to us, and they're very informative about vocabulary and how they saw the world. So it's a simple thing. If you have a class full of children and you talk about the beginning of writing and you ask them to imagine for a minute what the world would be like if there wasn't any writing, no one can imagine it. No books, no newspapers, no letters, no nothing. It's impossible to imagine it. So it's a very important human achievement to develop writing, that languages can be written down and then read by somebody else later on.
Yeah, and it's incredible that too these people, Mesopotamians and Babylonians, had not just created a writing system and were capable of figuring out, hey, we're going to put this into a clay tablet and then leave it somewhere. It was incredible too as to how structured their lives were.
Their lives were, and they used the writing very freely. People sent letters to one another and things like that. So when they're found on a dig, it's because they got buried, like, for example, if there was a destructive layer because of war and all the walls came down and everything would be buried in it, and or things like that. And that often happens on excavations when they find ancient buildings, what's left of them, they find documents like that, been there all that time. But yeah, you're right. It's good fun too.
Yeah. Now, with this writing system, with what they were writing, you said letters. What were things in their everyday lives that might stand out or be relatable? Were there things that they were afraid to say, or things that they were afraid to write down? They would have, uh, they would dance around it, or come up with a different way to say it without saying it.
Well, that's a very interesting question. On the whole, they're rather direct in the sense that there are quite a lot of letters to do with um, people who've made some arrangement, for example, to sell a load of barley for silver, and the barley has been taken and the silver's never arrived. And letters exist of that kind where people say, and when are you going to send my barley? Do I have to come round and see you? That kind of thing. Or when you're going to pay the money, sort of idea, rather abrupt. So I think when they had a point to make, they were rather straightforward. And also they're not squeamish about sex, because there's a bit of sex in the Epic of Gilgamesh where his chum Enkidu is seduced by what's known as a harlot, and there are also incantations and spells to help patients to do with people to do with sexual problems like impotence in males. There's a whole series of spells and rituals to deal with impotence, and they're rather to the point. So they didn't sugar things up. If they wanted to say things, they said things. They didn't have a I don't think they had a sort of sniggery type thing about sex, like as you say, going around it, or being embarrassed or something. Where such issues come in literature, they're perfectly straightforward, and I imagine that they were perfectly straightforward.
Yeah.
One of the things about them, which is the Mesopotamians, which is not like something one sees in our own lives very often, is they were great believers in the principle that you could tell what was going to happen in the future by things that happened to you. So, for example, if you're having dinner and a grasshopper falls off the rafter and lands in your beer, that's the sort of thing that to a Babylonian would be very ominous. It would have a significance, and they collected events of this kind in very long documents in such a way that they had a reference tool, so that when something happened, they could look up what had happened in the past. So, for example, if someone had that experience and then the next day their wife was run over by a mad charioteer, then they would know that that sort of thing had bad consequences. And they collected this kind of stuff over hundreds and hundreds of years, so that you could, for example, look up all the times when a different insect fell into a glass of beer, or insects fell into a bowl of soup, or into something else. So they tried to collect these things and record them for reference. But of course, there are hundreds and hundreds of lines like this, and they're not all, I'm not saying they all happened. There must have been a core of omens, as we call them, where A was thought to have had the consequence B, and they were all carefully noted. And say there was one like something falling into your soup, then they would think to themselves, well, other things fall into other fluids, and they would try and extend the principle as much as possible, so that if somebody had a I don't know, a large beetle falling into a glass of wine, they'd be able to find out what it meant. You see what I mean? They extended it, and they spent a lot of time doing this. There were hundreds and hundreds of documents with lines on about everything you could imagine, things in the heavens, things that happened to you by chance. And then they did other things as well. For example, they thought that the sheep have livers, right? And they had a conception that the liver of a sheep was used by one of the gods, in fact the sun god, was used as a writing board to give information on the liver of a sheep inside the sheep, so that a human specialist could slit the throat of the sheep for this ritual, remove the liver and examine it for what it told him. And this was a very highly developed science which persisted for at least 2,000 years, and they had omens drawn from different parts of the liver in a set order. So if you looked at it and there was something funny about the gallbladder or something like that, then you'd look up the gallbladder thing. Or if you found holes in the liver or lesions or this or that, they were all diagnostic, and there were specialists who could look at the liver. So for example, if a king was annoyed with his neighbor and decided he was going to go and have a fight and wanted to know what day of the week to go on, that sort of problem, then he would get his diviner, his specialist, to do a sheep's liver job and see what the liver told him about this thing. So there might be a sign on the liver which he knew would say, if this funny mark occurs on this part of the liver, it means the king will be successful in battle. So if he saw a thing like that, he would tell the king. So it was used as a sort of information outpost. And it sounds insane and rather unlikely to be successful, but in fact it developed from something probably rather elementary to a highly sophisticated system where it was thought to embody some structural truth about how the universe worked and the relationship between things that happened in the heavens and things that happened on the earth, and the extent to which the gods interfere with or arrange things that happened. So it was a sort of grid whereby they could tune in, if you like, to that sort of matter. So this was a very long-running and significant thing. Of course, the priests who did this probably cooked the sheep afterwards and had it for lunch, but